Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Men, Women and Happiness. I am Leanne Kansler, and I am joined by my co-host, Scott McLaughlin, and wonderful guest, Andrew Macdonald. Scott, would you like to introduce Andrew?
Well, yes, Andrew is someone I've known for some time. He comes to us from Perth, Ontario in Canada, and he's a family constellation practitioner and a certified Four Gateways coach. Does a lot of writing and training, and he described himself as a mistake expert at the PhD level, which is an interesting way to start it. I think what I'm really excited about in this episode today is that Andrew's talking about some things that were very, very central to why Leanne and I started this podcast in the first place. So, we've always had a view that we wanted to talk to the silent majority, and I think some of the issues that Andrew will talk about today will cover that. So, welcome again, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Scott. I don't know if I'm your first second-time guest. Probably not, but I'm happy to be here as a second-time guest. Yeah.
We're very happy to have you, that's for sure.
Thank you, Leanne. All right. So I'm just on. I'll just start with. So first of all, I just wanted to give a very short, point by point, the main thrust of what I'm wanting to say, and then we'll flush it out and maybe talk back and forth with the three of us around how that will look. So here's my sort of outline. There's a difference. This is obvious, but I'll say there's a difference between masculine and feminine ways of being. Women's is typically more feeling oriented. Men is typically more rational. Happiness for men and women means making space for both. But at present in our world, the feminine mode is taken as normal and healthy in all sorts of fields of our life, in schools, in courts, and it's in therapy. It's the default mode in therapy. So the challenge is to have a map that makes room for both. This means, among other things, men claiming their own space and women blessing that space. And I say it only giving it the one side because typically now women have claimed their own space in those areas, and the men have been silently blessing it. But there's a new meeting that can happen between women and men. And the central point about men not having a lot of space in the social conversation between women and men is that men have deferred to women as the experts in the intimate spaces, in the emotional space, at least in the public sphere. Because for a long time, at least 3 generations, we've had the narrative that men's history and role is to be an oppressor, and the patriarchy has not made it safe for women, and that women need to be heard, as of course they do. But the effect of that has been to make a great silencing come about for men, and that's I'm over 70 now, and I remember when that kind of came in. It was with the intensity almost of COVID, a wall-to-wall, nonstop messaging about the ills of men and the virtues of women. Mm-hmm. So that's been passed along for 3 generations now. So I'd be the grandfather, it'd be now the fathers, the next generation, and now the children who are now grown up, children are about to have children of their own. So at each, that message has not gone away. It's not talked about and it's not polite, but it is, I think, very much in the society. So that men feel in the the various spheres of men and women together, in conversation circles and explorations, in the courts, in the in schools at all levels, from starting in what we would call kindergarten right on through university, that the feminine modes of teaching, instruction, being, the relationship between feeling and facts, are favor the feminine mode, traditional feminine modes of interaction. And so that makes a problem for men, because, and especially, well, for men, but the more time has elapsed since that narrative started, I would argue 70 years ago or so, the more men have learned to defer and to not feel that they should bring up their own voice, because they feel of lesser value, but that they don't have a right to speak because they are the bad ones, and so they should defer.
I find that, it's an interesting observation. I think and I think you're absolutely right in the context that a lot of feminine influence has been had over, lots of things like courts and education and therapy and all those sorts of things. And, I guess I grew up watching the patriarchy holding onto the rope of the great tug of war pretty firmly, and trying to sort of hold on to that power base. Yeah. And not doing a really good job of it. And I would sort of also argue that that silence has become much greater in, my generation, Gen X's and Y's. I think we've probably been more silent than the baby boomer generation, who was sort of holding on to that tug of war kind of thing. I still don't want my wife to work, or I don't want her to have too much independence, or, I still think that was at play, certainly in my father's generation. And and I think this is a really important point to make for listeners, that what Andrew's talking about is the influence of feminism over those 70 years. He's not saying the patriarchy fell off a cliff 70 years ago, because it didn't. And it still, to some extent, plays out. And lots of people argue that. But the very point of this podcast is that this constant finger pointing or blaming, it's not helping people be happy. And I think that's what's really valuable, what Andrew's going to talk about today too, is how do we make those spaces for both of us to coexist or for both men and women to coexist in workspaces, in relationships, in life, in a way that both parties are truly being heard and seen. Is that fair to say, Andrew?
Yeah, for sure.
And I just wanted to add to that, it's important that we recognize, often the media has, as you mentioned, the finger pointing, but it does create a great sense of blame, shame, victimizing, like turning people into victims, making us feel like often women feel like they are the victim. When someone becomes the victim of society or the patriarchy or whatever you want to label it, it doesn't help. It just creates more division between the sexes, or between couples, or between families, or whatever it is. So to be able to, the way I kind of see it is, the patriarchy is this kind of thing right up high, and underneath it you have your regular everyday people who actually try not to subscribe to that, but all men have been labelled as being a part of that problem, which is very unfortunate. And all women have been labelled as, perhaps victims, apart from the feminists who are really out there spreading the word and that sort of thing. And the division has become bigger and bigger, which is not really the point of existence in this world. So these kind of conversations, which I'm sure will spark some interest and curiosity and rage, are about allowing us to just
or
say,
love.
or love, hopefully love. Yes, curiosity and interest can definitely promote love. Will help us to come together and go, all right, do we need to let go of some of these labels that we are throwing out there?
Yeah, and I think it's one thing I just want to lead into before we let Andrew talk some more is I put up on, I believe it was LinkedIn, after my interviews with men last year, I said something like, never mistake the silence of a man for his agreement.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for that, you guys. So there are so many avenues or threads that pull out of this doll here that we have, but one is that, to expand on the two modes of experiencing the world that it seems to me by the evidence that we have, is that women, and correct me if this generalization, and it is a generalization, it's not a truth for all women, but if it doesn't land right, or if it needs correction, but women are process and meet the world through a more feeling and relational interaction, and men tend to meet it more through a rational stepped back, take one step back and make a rational observation about it. And these two modes are the ways that men and women fundamentally approach life, I think. And I'm going to just relate that to the world of therapy, so that, and this is only one of, as we were saying, of many worlds that this conversation could happen in. But in the world of therapy, it's assumed that processing feelings is the way forward for women and men. It's a feminine style that suits feminine nature and interest, or archetypally feminine nature, more easily. But for men, it doesn't work well. Men do not naturally go that way. Men are good at feelings, actually, although the story is almost universally that they're not. Men are actually good at feelings. They just don't do it in the way that we imagine that it should be done, which is actually a more feminine mode. So I'm going to just outline a key difference is that men typically do better with something like a narrative therapy, where they can stand back, take some distance from the problem rather than entering into it. They get it in their masculine way right off the bat, but they need to look at it and observe it a little bit like you would be observing the character, or critiquing the character in a novel. You're going to analyze, what's he doing there? How's that working? How's that working in his life? And making a new decision, or based on what you're observing. I would like to do it this way, and trying that out. That's a more masculine approach to that. It's not the way that almost all therapy happens. And as you guys know, I'm sure, the American Medical Association called traditional masculinity I forget what the word was, but a pathological state, essentially, a few years ago. And because this is the underlying, although much less often stated, fact in our relations. So I think men and women both want and deserve respect, deep respect for each other. And I know it's been super important for me to be in spaces where men are respected, and hopefully I'm trying my best to offer that back. And probably men, but right now the common spaces that we're in, and we're in one right right now with you, Leanne, and Scott, and me, with men and women together. When we raise these issues, it tends to make people go into it. The respectful conversation we're having is at odds with the normal one that so often happens in circles, in exploratory circles between women and men. So probably the men will need to spend time with the men. Men will need to be with other men and hearing each other's stories, not trying to fix them or therapize them at all, but simply to hear the stories and to hear what men are intending to do, and maybe some, yeah. So there's a lot of complexity there I'm writing over, but to be in non-fixing spaces where the men can be with other men and just hear the stories, that's incredibly helpful for the men. That is a preparation for men being able to come into common spaces with women, feeling that they can own their own experience without having to lord it over or have it be not fear that it's not welcome, fear being shamed or criticized for being themselves. So men learning how to do that, and for the women to understand that men need that place of respect, deeply need that place of respect and honor, and to be able to bless them in that is a place for us to stand as we move towards what comes next for us, which is really a higher resonance of love and respect and possibility between us. All of that's there, and we and the just end this bit by saying the problems that we have in the world, in one way, are all related to this lack of mutual respect that men and women throughout society and in multiple areas. But we can claim so much of that ourselves and move into a place with a great deal of healing in it. And I think it'll do so much for the individual. And I'm hoping to be creating those spaces. Right now I'm just working with the men, but I do hope to work with men and women in creating a safe place of where the respect and the resonance between with the, I call it the higher unity, the love that's actually there between us and is our God-given masculinity and femininity. So
I think it's really interesting, right? That firstly and foremostly, I think it's fair to say that most of us believe that most people are inherently good. And you mentioned before we got onto this podcast about how men feel inadequate. And so if you believe and trust that people's intentions are inherently good, but you don't understand the inadequacy that men feel, then you can't interact with them in a way that's healthy. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, until that dynamic comes to the surface, that we both have equal rights and equal, we pay a lip service to that, but deep down there is a sense that men are dealing less well with life than, I mean, kind of like, to make the extreme, it's like Barbie world, right? That's too strong, but that the woman's way is the right, is the sensitive, morally superior, healthy way, and men are just are clutches, or not tuned into it, whereas that disrespectful basis is the starting point after several generations. It's the starting point in our society. It may even have been deliberately set apart to make us isolated and confused. But
it's interesting because it's I think in so much of our society, and it would be very, I would say, piercing for some listeners to hear you say men needing to be respected, right? I can imagine people going,
Uh-huh.
around their heads like, "Are you crazy? Or what's going on? What are you talking about being respected?" But where we fall over is that true empathy comes from understanding. And if we don't understand that men are not speaking, right, and men are not speaking up, and that men are giving up, right, their inherent, I think you've called it self-respect before, without women really understanding that. And then I think that's fair to say that the average woman wouldn't really understand that men, we're trying to be compliant. We're trying not to get in the way of progress, most of us. And most of us have good intent, but in that silence, we're losing ourselves a little bit, or a lot.
Yeah. I just
And
want to add to that, Scott.
yeah,
I think inherently, most people have a sense of inadequacy. Doesn't matter how they identify, and that sense of not being good enough. And most of us also have a kind of people-pleasing aspect about us, or a aversion to conflict. And so we learn very early in relationship, whether it be with our parents, teachers, or our partners or friends, how to keep quiet, how to keep the peace. And it tends to get worse and worse as we get older, and we avoid conflict. And it's really important that we all respect each other, but we also really need to learn how to respect ourselves. Because when we respect ourselves, that's when we set very clear boundaries around what's acceptable and what's not. And if we can't enforce those boundaries with love, and with being assertive, like you don't want to enforce boundaries aggressively unless you're in danger, but through being assertive and knowing who you are and what you stand for, that's when we will see a lot of disrespect, a lot of fighting, a lot of hating on each other, and really learning how to understand yourself and your partner on a much deeper level than what social media will tell us is, and what movies tell us, is so important. And, yeah. What are your thoughts on that, Andrew?
I'll let Andrew talk, sorry.
Well, thanks, Leanne. That's absolutely right. That this is a problem that faces every human being, and why I think it's valuable to see the specific social dynamic coming about is that it's out of balance. And so if we don't recognize, I think, and I struggled with this a lot because I'm also highly spiritually interested in our common relationship to what's above us. But if we are blind to a strong social dynamic, for example, if a boy grows up and he's never heard of a positive reflection of men or what a healthy manhood would look like, or seen a model of it, he will, no matter how much he tries to be taking care of his self-respect, he will continually run into that social certainty that it is this way. And women have their own have another version of that as well. And it's a form of unconscious entitlement that women don't want to, that is hard for women to speak to, because it seems like they're busting their solidarity with their sisters, and they're shamed for that, and they are given. I mean, a woman could imagine doing that to claim, oh, there's another side to this, and she will get pushback from her sisters. This is my experience of hearing from people, and strong pushback from sisters. So it helps to have a map that we can acknowledge, and especially if men and women are coming together, we can acknowledge a common map that we're all struggling with this, and we have unique ways in which we do it, and those ways are unconscious in our society. We don't see some of that fundamentally.
And you're starting to see the emergence of some women, and on social media you have to be careful, because I think sometimes people like to speak to narratives that get them the most followers. But you know, I am seeing a lot more women speaking up about men's health, and and speaking up about really the statistical realities of the fact that this silence, and you know, for people of my generation, I certainly didn't look up to the way that my forefathers treated their wives, or acted in their misogynistic pathways. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that some of that misogyny didn't get into my veins. I'm sure it did. But, you know, at the same time, you know, I've lost an insane amount of friends to suicide. And in fact, that's how Leanne and I met, because she did a TED talk on this. But, you know, what I find alarming, and that this is maybe the overarching female narrative, is particularly in Australia, the rate of male suicide, as we know, is crazy. But if you look at the expenditure on mental health, and men's mental health proportionally to women's mental health, it's tiny. So how could that be? If you've got more problems in Camp A, you're going to invest more in Camp B. It doesn't make any sense. So at a pragmatic level, there I am being a guy. You know, there is an overarching female narrative, and I'm sure that the average woman doesn't want to see more and more men pass away to suicide. I'm sure that's true.
Absolutely, because that affects everybody.
Yes, and yet our government investment or our court systems are set up in such a way that men walk away the loser, the one more likely to lose access to children, or to, you know, to be isolated, you know, from a broken relationship. And I just don't understand how, you know, how that's possible. And I think this is why I love what Andrew has to say, is that, you know, we have to get to a stage and a point where we say, well, actually, why is this happening? These guys aren't saying too much. We've been telling them that the patriarchy is the problem. They're not opposing that, and yet they're killing themselves. So what is actually going on underneath the rug there? And it was funny. I had a conversation with a guy on the weekend, and I thought, and this is a sad reality of where we're at. Two comments I made to Andrew before was that there's an American author. I think he's an American author, is he? And he said, if you were to look at a marriage like an investment in the stock market, you would look at it as a long-range shot. You just wouldn't do it. And I had this friend of mine on the weekend say to me, you know what, Scott, I've always wanted to be a father, but I absolutely positively do not want a wife. And I'm like, wow, that's horrible that we've gotten to that point.
Well, that's a whole nother conversation, Scott.
It is, but
yeah.
it is. Yeah, it's interesting though, Scott. Can I just make I know we're probably almost out of time here, but I wanted to make just one point that's follows from what came earlier. But when you mentioned the amounts spent on men's versus women's mental health, the trouble is that I don't think there's any amount of men's mental health support that could be poured into the system present, because it would simply reinforce the status quo. Because when men are sent to programs and stuff, or to they're informed of how they're not doing it right, and how their entire instruction is support the women. And a whole generations of men have grown up deeply influenced by this, and they are confused. They do not have the map, and women don't have the map either. It's a map where there's got to be room for both of us to stand in our loving selves, be the woman that we are, or be the man that we are, and have respect for the other. So,
I think that's so true. And a lot of women believe that they do have the map. And I see this with couples all the time where the women are very, very rigid in their stance that they are right and their partners are wrong. And it's clearly not always the case. And it takes a lot of work to change that map and to change that narrative and to help them realize that, hang on a minute, just because you think you're right doesn't mean you are. And I think that's a point that all people need to hold on to. Something that I even realized just this weekend, that's something I was quite firm about. I'm now softening around thinking, maybe my stance on this particular issue is wrong. And it's really quite liberating to acknowledge that I could be wrong here and there could be something else underlying what's going on. And I would really love to encourage our listeners who are in relationship to look at their stance, and is that stance causing more harm than good? And even if you're a little bit curious about it, talk about it, not to a friend or a family member, but to a therapist or counselor or someone that you don't know that well, someone who won't buy into your story or your narrative, because that's what happens. And sort of figure out, well, if I'm wrong in my stance, what does that actually mean for me and my relationship? And can I step out of that steadfast thought?
And also, I'd probably add to that, where did the stance come from? Is it truly mine, or have I bought into, a societal, norm to take this stance? So, Andrew, before we wrap up, I want to give you an opportunity to say a few more words.
I just want to say thank you. Really, I really appreciate what you're saying here, Leanne. I think that's humble and true. That we don't know, but having a lot of room for each other to be ourselves, to be wrong, to be exploring, to not come to the male-female conversation with our certainties intact, but to be able to listen. That's so hard to do. So there's so much more to be said into this space. But here's to.
That's why you'll definitely be a repeat offender here. We'll get you on again and again and again.
I'd love to come and talk to how that respect would look like, or how we could move towards that exploratory respect place. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
And any final words from you?
No, thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure talking to you again. And yes, Scott is right. I'm sure we will talk to you. I like the idea of exploring respect. Respect is huge, and it's something that I feel, have in many relationships and with ourselves forgotten, and not just relationships with our partners, relationships in general.
Yes, very true. Very true. All right. Well, I want to thank you too, Andrew, and it's always a pleasure. And you and I speak on and off the field a fair bit, but it's I think you've got a lot more to talk about, and I think some of the central issues you're talking about are precisely the reason that Leanne and I started this podcast in the first place. And so I want to thank you for your time again, and thank you everyone for listening. Please, any comments, we really encourage them as we try to steer our way through the murky waters of where we're at. So thanks again for joining us. And thank you, Andrew. And
thanks, guys.
And I'll close it off. Bye for now, guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.